We are glad to welcome leading Russian and foreign experts who will be sharing with us their observations about their approaches to how we regulate the policy in climate change and sustainable development. And we hope that during today's discussion, we'll get closer to developing recipes and responses to those critical challenges of our current decade. Uh, we have here Alexey Shadrin, who is in charge of the Russian carbon fund. They are our colleagues and partners. They initiated this discussion. We were glad to respond to their requests, and we really hope that this debate will help us all understand better what we can call consensus in developing policies in the area of climate change and sustainable development. We have an extensive program for today. Let me say a few words about how we're going to organize the discussion. It's going to be divided into a number of smaller parts, two speakers in each part, one from Russia, another from one of the foreign countries that are our partners. In the course of those brief sessions, we as moderators will be asking questions to our speakers, and each one of them will have to be brief and concise, and I hope to be able to give the floor to all our representatives here. Let me now give the floor to Alexey Shadrin, who is going to share some of his observations about our main topic here and uh, start our discussion. Thank you, Andrei. I welcome all our speakers and guests of today's event. We have hundreds of people who registered. Uh, that's why this topic is really important. Everyone wants to know what we'll be expecting after the crisis. As you can see, I'm fully dressed. I'm not wearing a t-shirt or anything. I have my jacket, I have my pants on, which means the lockdown is almost over. We are uh, leaving this mode of lockdown, and we physically begin to get back to work as many other people in the world. So congratulations on that. Going back to our colleagues, to our coolers and water coolers and the coffee machines and restaurants, we are happy, and at the same time we are sad. The world will never be the same again. It's a different world, and the kind of world we get depends on all of us. And now we have this great chance to discuss some of the hidden secrets of today's world thanks to our guests. We are going to take a journey to understand of how this structural crisis impacted environment, economy, and the social sphere, the three parts of the sustainable development concept developed by the UN. We have people online who were the pioneers of this concept when it was developed and implemented in various countries of the world. And it is these people that our future depends on. That's why we were so careful. That's why we need so much to understand the consequences of the crisis. As we mentioned, it's going to be divided into 5 parts. I hope we'll be quite dynamic, going through questions and answers. We'll have 15 minutes for each session. At the very end, we'll have some short Q&A session, additional 15 or 20 minutes to get questions from our audience. And also during the debate, we'll be asking some questions to our speakers. So we need to start our debate. Before we move on to the topic of analyzing the consequences of the crisis, it's important for us to understand the background, how we reached that situation. Let's look into the past for now, for a few moments, and try to understand what we had by the beginning of the crisis, by the beginning of the pandemic. What was the social and climatic agenda for the beginning of 2020? I'm sure that our ideal speaker for this topic would be Klaus Milke. He is the chairman of the steering group of the international F20 platform, which is operating as part of the G20 process. He also is the founder of a number of key environmental organizations in Germany and honorary chairman of German Watch, a leading German environmental foundation, and Agrafina Kotova, expert from the Russian delegation to the 25th COP of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change that took place last year in Madrid. As of that moment, Agrafina was also the consultant of the Department of Energy Efficiency and Environment for the Ministry of Energy here in Russia for 3 years. So we need to start. My first question goes to Klaus. It's in accordance with the tradition of Russian hospitality. We always ask our first questions to our guests. All right, and here's our question. It's about the success that we were able to achieve in 5 minutes since the Sustainable Development Goals were approved during the environmental summit in Paris and the Paris Agreement itself. 5 years later, we can come up with some preliminary results. It's important for us to know your opinion on that. And what is the role of F20 in that as an organization? Please, you may have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much, and good afternoon to all of you in the round of people here in the speakers room, but also the audience outside. Thanks to the organizers to bring up this important event and with all these excellent speakers. Well, the Paris Agreement from December 2015 during the last 5 years has changed the global debate for our common future, not less than the present corona crisis, perhaps already even more. And also in many countries, very much in the global south, the 2030 agenda of the United Nations from September 2015 with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, became more and more relevant for policy making and the mainstream developments. It must be clear and well understood that mankind is able to combat the present COVID-19 crisis, but by our national health services, ventilators, or vaccines, but also by making our societies more resilient and try to recover better. It is also clear that we can't negotiate with inequity, injustice, nature, and the planetary boundaries. The best medicines against inequity and poverty, pollution, or the climate crisis are a global just transition and the implementation of the 2030 agenda with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. The quickly developing sustainable finance agenda shows in addition very clearly big financial actors and important parts of the financial markets have well understood. They all can make a difference to raise ambition for higher climate targets towards global carbon neutrality in 2050. So we as Foundations 20, an international platform of more than 60 foundations, mostly in G20 states, underline also foundations and philanthropists have to take a stand and should try to be part of the solutions. We can encourage the political leaders to do their jobs right. And we can bridge towards the business sector, towards the financial actors, toward think tanks and other parts of civil society, the NGOs. Just to explain, a foundation or philanthropic organization is a category of non-profit organization or charitable trusts. Some engage directly in charitable, social or ecologic activities or common goods. Examples for foundations are Rockefeller Brothers Fund in United States, Robert Bosch Foundation or BMW Foundation Herbert Quandt in Germany. as private foundations. So far from my side.
All right, our next question goes to Agrafina. All right, let's say the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement were approved by many countries of the world. This is something that we use as we proceed further. Why the latest climatic change in Madrid, why many believe that they were not successful, and why the next conference on climate change is so important. Thank you, Alexey, distinguished colleagues and friends. I'd like to first of all thank the organizers of this roundtable debate for being able to bring together so many different specialists in this new format as we discuss sustainable development and climate policy and the situation of COVID crisis. When we finished our negotiations in December 29 in Madrid, and those were really hard negotiations, and some matters still remained unresolved, but even most experienced negotiators couldn't even imagine that in a few months the world would change so much that the next conference will be moved to 2021, and even the supplementary or auxiliary bodies will not be able to restart their normal operation. Of course, it complicates our work, but the discussions are still going on through online channels, including on those issues that remained unresolved. There were many such issues, starting from strengthening the contribution of different countries, especially from the point of view of the most vulnerable countries and the EU countries. But let me first of all speak about the most important issue of all. That's Article 6 on international cooperation. When we talk about differences on that particular item in the agenda, those differences of um, are of two types, the technical ones and the matters of principle. When we talk about matters of principle, these are uh, uh, this is about Article 6.2, which is not in line. Some of those share of proceeds issues, also the transfer of units from Kyoto period to Paris period. The EU countries were against it because in their opinion that would destroy the carbon market during the Paris period. The developing countries were favoring that transfer, and Japan, strange as it may sound. What would happen next? The auxiliary bodies continue this discussion in groups. They continue debating the drafts of the future agreements. If we don't find the middle ground, I doubt that the next conference will be successful. Thank you. Thank you. Our next question goes to Klaus. All right, now in Europe, we're witnessing this powerful movement to support the Paris Agreement, to support this overall transition to the green economy. They call it the European Green Deal. Could you tell us a few words about what it is all about in a couple of words, and how its implementation will impact the Paris Agreement and the relations between the EU and its partners? The floor is yours. I'm sorry, you need to turn on your mic.
Here I am. As a result of the developments after the Paris Climate Agreement during the last 5 years and new findings of science, the EU experienced somehow a climate vote in last elections in spring 2019 for the EU Parliament that produced a self-proclaimed climate commission, I would say, led by a conservative social democrats grand coalition in the European Commission, with its president Ursula von der Leyen and vice president Franz Timmermans. Since then, the EU has significantly accelerated its climate policy speed, mainly with proclaiming the, from you mentioned already, the European Green Deal, the EGD, at COP25 in Madrid in December 2019, calling it the EU's Man to the Moon project. What is the essence of the EGD? The EGD is mainly about making the EU fit for the great transformation of its economy and of its lifestyles. Fit for the transformation in order to reach what the EU and all countries subscribed to 2015 in the Paris Agreement, not letting the world heat up more than 1.5 or well below 2 degrees centigrade. Therefore, the main goals of the EGD are first, net zero emissions, neutrality of emissions and sinks of greenhouse gases by 2050, and second, the 2030 goal of lowering greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 up to minus 50 or 55% below the 1990 level. For the EU, these goals will not be that easy to reach. But still, the Fridays for Future movement with millions of young people all over the EU demands more ambitious targets from the EU, and also positive industry is raising its voice. And why is the EU's EGD so relevant for other countries, and mainly the neighbors of the EU as Russia? Very shortly, raising EU climate targets for 2030 up to 2050 is a must and will come. As a consequence, the emissions trading system, the ETS, has to be developed further, and the CO2 price will rise further from the current 20 euro per ton CO2, and more sectors need to be fully included into the ETS, like, for instance, aviation. But this also means a carbon border adjustment, some call it a border tax, is becoming more and more likely, which adds to the pressure in all other exporting countries outside the EU to introduce meaningful CO2 prices or similar measures. As another consequence of raising the climate targets, decarbonization of the EU transport system will come faster, which means a decrease of oil use to almost zero by 2050 and maybe earlier. And we see today, the EGD is already somewhat echoed in other countries. For instance, California, South Korea, Norway, Morocco, and Ukraine. Signals from other countries were positive before the corona crisis, and we will have to see how they continue on transforming their economies, China, India, South Africa. But the EU can become carbon neutral much easier and cheaper if it cooperates and has transformative trade relations with Russia. But this depends on the readiness of both sides. Thank you.
Thank you, Klaus. Moving on, for this next question is for Agrafina. All right, we have some leaders in the climate agreement and Russia has ratified it. In your opinion, what is the main factor for the success in Glasgow? What is the prerequisite to get the consensus of all countries on Paris Agreement? I have a very simple answer to your very good question. and it's easier to voice it than to implement it. The success of the next COP in Glasgow depends only on one thing, whether the parties during the intermediary sessions of auxiliary bodies, whether they will be able to prepare such projects and decisions that would be approved by all countries. Perhaps you have some maybe hints or uh, particular ideas about where we require rapprochement in particular. Of course, it's mostly about Article 6, because without solutions on that issue, lots of other issues are hindered. During the 25th conference, the EU countries mentioned their ambitious goals and plans. The European Green Deal that was just mentioned. On top of that, if we mention other countries, we can recall Japan, which has high hopes for those decisions to be made, because they already initiated a joint trading mechanism, and they are looking at the potential volume of units that they might get from 5 to 600 million tons, and they have a whole pool of projects with 17 countries. The EU, for the EU and Japan, they really need that kind of resolution. These are the countries, in my opinion, that really require that decision on Article 6. Of course, all parties will be able to take part in the international cooperation. Let's just hope that it will work. All right, very briefly, for our audience, what is the meaning of Article 6? Is it about financing? If we talk about Article 6, it can be divided into three parts. First of all, it's a point 6.2 about joint approaches. It's item 6.4, rules, modalities, and procedures, and paragraph 6.8, which is a work program under the framework of non-market approaches. When the decisions are made about these three paragraphs, we will be able to transfer units to others and work on joint projects only if those matters are resolved. And the final question to Klaus first, and then to Agrafina. Klaus, how do you see those bridges that could be built and could be profitable for both Russia and other partners when we deal with the Green Deal and the Paris Agreement? Of course, there are differences. Where is the main potential of our unification and cooperation, in your opinion?
Well, Russia, the government.
Your mic is off again. I'm sorry, Klaus.
Yeah. Russia, the government, and the non-state actors will probably very soon stand at a crossroads decision moment. Will Russia partner with the EU and other countries in this transition, or will it largely shut down business relations with the EU and hope for a continued high carbon pathway in other parts of the world? It is very obvious. We need more transformative cooperation between Russia and the EU. I am absolutely convinced. With this transformative, I mean transformative for both economies. One example is switching Russian oil and gas exports to climate neutral hydrogen. There are more options for cooperation in light of the EGD and the Paris Agreement. One can discuss that would be beneficial for Russia and the EU. Cooperation on smart power grids or smart city technologies could be further options for both sides. So let us try to be part of the solutions, please, together. Thank you.
Thank you, Klaus, for your overview. Even though you didn't have much time, but you clearly defined the areas where we have some prospects for cooperation. Now, let's move on to the next part of our discussion here. Thank you, Klaus and Agrafina, for your initial contributions. And our next topic is just as interesting and important. And here, Andre will help me. Thank you, colleagues. We are still doing good on time. And our next topic is perhaps one of the most debatable and topical. We call this brief part the planet without people. Will the environmental situation improve as the result of the pandemic? And for that, we have two leading experts in the industry, Mojib Latif from Germany. He is a professor of Helmholtz for ocean research in Kiel, and he is also chairman of the board of the German Climate Consortium and German chapter of Club of Rome. And also Ms. Davidova, who is an environmental journalist and uh, is in charge of the Environmental Information Bureau and was an observer during the climate conference. Thank you, colleagues, for being here, and Alexey will be asking you questions. We will start this session with a question to a lady, Angelina. All right, Angelina, you are a journalist and you can sense all the changes in the society. You can see them. You talk a lot with the young people, with all the other generations. Please tell us, in your opinion, how did the lockdown impact the environmental situation, and will that impact be or have long-term consequences? Thank you for your question. That's a really important issue. There are lots of debates today on that in the Russian media, internationally, and there's not an easy answer because the pandemic and the other limiting measures, the lockdown, impacted the economies in the world in a special way. On the one hand, we reduced the emissions of pollutants and greenhouse gases locally and temporarily. As soon as the economy restores, we are to expect the growth of emissions of greenhouse gases and pollutants, and it's time for us to start thinking about how do we want to restore the economy, and should we have the green measures, the Green Deal measures that were mentioned in the first part by Klaus. So, of course, we at this point getting cleaner air, bluer sky in the cities, and it's easier for us to breathe, not so much noise, not so much smog. And will we be able to keep it like that for the post-pandemic time? It's a totally different story with waste. The situation with waste is even more is getting more complicated because over the lockdown and pandemic time, the amount of waste which is not recyclable increased, including medical waste in a number of countries, including Russia. They're facing difficulties with separate collection and recycling of waste. And again, a great issue is how we will be able to live in the new situation and stop consuming so much disposable plastic wrapping and packaging, which can rarely be recyclable, and how can we change our consumer habits and disposing of our waste. Also, here we're talking about the future of sharing economy and all those programs and elements that have been introduced, including car sharing that was so successful in many Russian cities, all the way to some grassroots initiatives. Another major issue is public transport in the cities. On top of the problem of transport pollution is serious. Many cities of the world, including Russian cities, were trying to develop public transport and introduce limitations for private transport that uses um, carbohydrates, but now we need to change our overall approach to the city mobility, to urban mobility, to public transport in the world. How can we support electric mobility? There are lots of uh, solutions that we can borrow from different countries of the world to develop pedestrian infrastructure and electrical vehicles. So in a sense, the situation improved temporarily. In some areas, it's gotten worse, but the pandemic and the lockdown is the time when we can think about finer things and think about what we can preserve out of what we witness today and how we need to transform our life so it gets better, greener, more sustainable. Thank you, Angelina, for your expert approach to this problem. But we also welcome here with us Mr. Latif, who represents climate science, so to speak. And let's ask the real professional in this field. Is it true that the lockdown brought us closer to Paris Agreement goals to reducing the emissions, or is it not true?
Well, may I ask you to allow me to share the screen so that I can show a few slides? Still not possible. It won't work. I don't know who's the official moderator. Only the moderator can give me the permission to share the screen. Ah, okay. Now, all right. So, can you give me a feedback, please, whether you can see my slides?
Well, I think we can see your slides.
Very good. Thank you. All right. So that there are so many things to say about the pandemic and climate change because we are basically looking through a magnifying glass, okay, and we see what we are doing wrong when we cope with global crisis. And one aspect of this is that there is a tremendous lack of international cooperation. Okay, so I think we could have avoided the pandemic if from the very beginning there would have been international collaboration. And I mean, this is also one of the key points with regard to mitigating climate change. We desperately need international cooperation because you can't solve the climate change problem nationally. So let me be a little bit more specific and let me take you back to the year 2007, all right? And I'm taking you back more than a decade because at that time we already had a lot of attention. Okay, so you may remember the movie by former Vice President of the United States, Al Gore, An Inconvenient Truth. Okay, was seen by millions and millions of people. At the same time, the International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, published its fourth assessment report, and both the movie and the assessment report by the IPCC caught a lot of attention. And this winded up with that Al Gore and the chairman of the IPCC, Pachauri, who can be seen here, received the Peace Nobel Prize. Okay, So you would have thought that things are now in a good shape. But then what happened was the financial crisis. So initiated by the breakdown of the bank Lehman Brothers in the United States, okay, and the financial crisis developed into an economic crisis. And then, you know, 1 year after the Peace Nobel Prize, the topic climate change was basically out. Nobody talked more or less any longer about it, and the only thing that mattered was economy. And we basically brought up the economy in a very non-sustainable manner. And in principle, we are now in the same situation. Here last year, you know, Fridays for Future, the movement by the young people, okay. So we had a lot of discussion, a lot of attention. Klaus Mielke mentioned the European votes, okay, where climate change was the topic, at least in Germany, okay. And one result of this was that the Green Party had a major increase in votes. And now, back to square one. Okay, everybody talks about the pandemic. Okay, now we are resuming the discussion about climate change and sustainability. Let me give you a flavor of the challenge we are facing. Okay, because many people are not aware of the scale of the challenge. Okay, what we see here on the left is the CO2 concentration of the atmosphere. So the CO2 content of the atmosphere since the beginning of the direct measurements, since 1958. And you see it's increasing and increasing, and there is no sign that it will stop increasing. Now on the right, and that's the interesting part, we see the last year, okay? Only the last year. And the highest CO2 levels are reached during a year in May. Now, if you compare this May with May of last year, you see, again, we are much higher in terms of CO2 content in the atmosphere than we have been in the previous year. So despite the lockdown, okay, which have reduced CO2 emissions a lot, okay, the content, and that's the only thing that matters, because that drives the climate. The content is still going up. And this shows us that, you know, a single year with CO2 emissions won't be sufficient. What we need is year by year a reduction in CO2 emissions of the scale that we are having this year, okay, until we are more or less carbon neutral by 2050 or so. Now, temperature is inert anyway, okay. We see here the April temperatures globally averaged since the beginning of the measurements, 1880. The last bar is 2020. And you see, you know, climate doesn't care for short-term measures. Climate only cares for a long-term strategy. And so, I mean, the headline for the COP25 in Madrid was "Time for Action." And I can just only reinforce it's really time for action. You know, we had enough words. We need to act now, and we need to act fast if we really want to meet the targets put down in the Paris Agreement to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees relative to pre-industrial times, or even limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Latif, for this concentrated and clear response to the question that we were all interested in. And my next question goes to Angelina. All right, you are like a barometer of the mood in the society. Do you believe that the lockdown put us further from the solution to the environmental issues? Do we still remember who Greta Thunberg was, who was the center of attention just a few months ago? in my opinion, they don't talk about climate issues that much or write about them as much, but I think people still think just as much about that. Uh, every day I get a few requests for interviews and um, to make comments on the green future. People are interested in how the world will continue to develop in the future. Will not the world will not be the same, will not be as it used to be before the coronavirus crisis, and the experience that we are going through right now with the pandemic and the global uh, crisis, it also opened the awareness of the risk of further crises. Now, many people began to think, okay, if we're so vulnerable to this crisis, we will be just as vulnerable to other crises, including the climate change or disappearance of certain species of animals and plants, the biodiversity issue, the environmental pollution issue, and this new awareness of the crisis and the awareness that these crises exist and they can turn over our life upside down, this awareness is creeping back into public uh, thinking, and we are trying to uh, change our life after the crisis. Well, Greta Thunberg is not as popular as she was a few months ago, but it's not that bad, because it would be wrong to connect the entire environmental movement to just one person. Even in Russia, we have these Fridays for Future movement. Even in Russia, the climate and green movements are getting stronger. In that sense, the issues that are of concern for people in Russia, including the young ones, are no different from what concerns the young people in Germany and in other countries. I mentioned Germany just because some of our speakers are from that country. And this awareness of common threats, and that awareness of global risks and problems, and it's critical to develop cooperation. What both of our speakers from Europe mentioned in the first two sections, that's one of the key results of our debates as of now. Okay, Mr. Latif also represents the Club of Rome in Germany. The Club of Rome is the kind of organization which was first to publish the reports of Denis Medoza, The Limits of Growth, which has shown at the end of the 20th century that the environmental impact was directly linked with economy and the social sphere, predicting the current crisis. All right, Mr. Latif, here's my question to you. We know that the Club of Rome recently issued recommendations to G20 countries to combat the crisis. Could you just briefly, in 2 or 3 minutes, tell us about the position of the Club of Rome and how the Club of Rome, what it says as it addresses the G20 leaders?
Well, I think most people, not only the political leaders, but also the economic leaders, know that climate change is really one of the largest challenges mankind is facing. And this has become clear at the last Davos World Economic Forum. Okay, so it was in January, just several months ago, but we have basically forgotten. Okay, and climate change was the theme on that forum. Okay, and I think what we need to keep in mind is that we can't really solve the climate issue, for instance, in isolation. I mean, we need to take a broad approach, okay, a systematic approach, because I mean, the lack of sustainability is seen in terms of many, many symptoms. Okay, climate change, global warming is one system. The lack of biodiversity is another system. You know, the increase of plastic in the oceans, again, another one. The burning of the rainforests, increase of inequality. Okay, and this basically comes back to what we discussed in the beginning. I mean, sustainability is not just environment. Sustainability is about economy, and sustainability has also the social dimension. And I think this is what we need to keep in mind, that we really need a more general approach. Okay, and now, I mean, since we have this pandemic, we have the unique opportunity, you know, to really make a major transition. Okay, because nobody thought that so much money would be available within a relatively short time. And so I think well, what the Club of Rome is basically saying is that we should really consider climate change and the other challenges mankind is facing as extremely critical for the well-being of humanity. Okay, and I basically come back to my last statement, during my last statement. I mean, it's time for action. We have no time to waste any longer. Okay, we had enough words, and I hope that Europe, for instance, in cooperation with Russia, will really make a difference now. Okay, that there will be short-term measures. Okay, and me personally, I believe that one short-term measure, and we have seen this last year in 2019, one short-term measure is carbon pricing. I mean, you need carbon pricing, and carbon pricing, I don't want to explain it now, but carbon pricing was the reason why in Germany, 2019, the CO2 emissions fell by more than 50 million tons, okay, because the price within the European trading system went up, okay, and this had a major effect on the German CO2 emissions. And so I think we need either a tax or a trading system or whatever, but I think this would be a short-term measure by which you can really make a major step forward in cutting greenhouse gas emissions.
All right, thank you, Mr. Latif. Moving on to our next segment, where we are going to discuss how crisis impacted the environmental policy and green economy globally. Originally, we planned 2 speakers to take part in it, but our Russian representative was not able to join the meeting because she had to be at some kind of government meeting on the same issue. But nevertheless, we have Mr. Kayo Koch-Weiser, who is a chair of the advisory board of European Climate Fund. He used to be deputy chairman of Deutsche Bank and deputy minister of finance of Germany, and also managing director of the World Bank. Mr. Koch-Weiser, here's my question. Some experts say that the current pandemic of the new coronavirus is caused by the climate change, because climate impacts the habitat of animals, and that may have led to this tragic chain of events and mutation of the virus, which eventually caused this global pandemic. What do you think on that? Microphone, please.
Do you hear me now?
Yes, it's fine now.
Yeah. Frankly, I'm not expert on that question. I was expected to talk about global environmental policies and finance. I'm an economist and financial expert, so I'm afraid you might have other experts here to answer that specific question on those links. But I would very much like to address the question as it was put to that third session, if I may.
Okay, then tackle the issue of finance and economy then. We'll get back to the biological issue later.
Well, before I come to that, let me also congratulate the Valdai Club to having organized this very important roundtable. As a participant in the very close cooperation between the German and Russian governments 20 years ago at the highest levels, I hope that a similar productive cooperation will be developed on sustainability and climate between Russia, Germany, and the European Union in coming years. In the few minutes I have, I would like to make 4 points in response to the question of how global actors are reacting or not reacting to the crisis. 4 points on the risks and opportunities for action and what we see now. First point, with governments struggling with the collapse of economic activity in the double digits, the risk of postponing climate action under the Paris Agreement is severe. However, I'm encouraged by the initial G20, EU Council, China State Council, UK government, and other announcements of continued commitment to Paris. And in fact, the calls for green recovery as a great opportunity out of the crisis. This is also mirrored, in my experience, in large parts of the corporate and financial sectors now. We have come a long way here. Obviously, we have to monitor closely that announcements are truly followed by action in coming months. Second, such actions are likely to be further propelled by an expected gradual but massive shift, I believe, in societal preference and political priorities, shift from efficiency to resilience. Under the banner and considerations of greater resilience of our systems, so badly missed during the corona crisis, relocalization of supply chains, less globalization, safer systems domestically, preference for health rather than consumption growth, to mention just a few, will likely take place. From just-in-time efficiency to just-in-case resilience. This societal desire for more immediate pandemic resilience can and will translate eventually into a longer-term desire for climate and social resilience. Here lies the opportunity not to be missed and to be built upon by key actors in government, business, and society at large. Third, the huge stimulus, support and bailout, guarantee and investment programs governments are laying on at present run the risk of missing, but also offer the opportunity for green recovery built into them. Bailouts only for electric vehicles in the automotive sector. Bailouts only for airlines reducing emissions and abandoning short-haul flights. Investment in renewables and hydrogen technology, in EV charging infrastructure, energy efficiency for the huge existing building stock are a few of a long list of examples. The EU Recovery Fund actually is an excellent example of such proposals. And fourth, the crisis poses enormous economic and financial risks for the public and private finance sectors and markets, and leads to huge unorthodox responses by central banks, governments, and international financial institutions. Corporates and banks have to restructure and adjust in order to survive. Such massive support and liquidity schemes and commitments, also by taxpayers, offer the opportunity of rebuilding not to the past, but to a sustainable future. making carbon risk disclosure in corporate balance sheets mandatory, strengthening or introducing strong and credible carbon pricing, and expanding green markets and instruments should be part of the strategy and the social deal to ensure lasting resilience coming out of the crisis. An encouraging example of what I'm talking about is the European Commission proposal to finance the recovery fund in part from the income generated by a strengthened emissions trading system with higher carbon prices. I hope Russia will be a strong player domestically and internationally on all these fronts. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Koch-Weiser, for your response. In your opinion, what other areas of cooperation we may have between the EU and Russia that could help us recover from a crisis and also deal with the larger crisis, the climate crisis?
Well, I'm very encouraged by Russia's stance vis-à-vis the Paris Agreement now, having joined the Paris Agreement. In the run-up to Glasgow, and with the US being basically a total failure on that front now, we have to build coalitions to bring the ambition and the enhanced ambition that Tifa talking about to bear in Glasgow. And my first point in response would be, I very much hope that Russia, the European Union, within European Union, I think Germany and Russia, given traditional ties, to be reactivated, and of course China should be the moving force. That's on the international environmental policy front. Russia has, but there are other experts here who know more about that, great opportunity for carbon reducing technologies and economic activities. When I was involved from Ministry of Finance in Germany 20 years ago, I mentioned we felt that there would be, through the private sector and demonstration projects, great scope for the German private sector, and I would say the European private sector, to cooperate with Russian companies. And I hope that this is a political statement. I really hope that all the issues that have stood in the way in recent years between closer political, maybe also economic cooperations and the sanctions between Russia and Europe will be succeeded by a more open attitude and changes in policy on both sides. Russia has huge potential, but also huge risks in the climate area, given the permafrost, Siberia disappearing, and so on. The technologies for dealing with that exist. And finally, I would think we all have to move out of fossil fuels. For Russia, a big issue. Gas is better than oil. And of course, transition technology, it might be gas for some more time. But eventually, I think we can work together on technologies to move out of the fossils entirely.
Thank you, Mr. Koch-Weiser. We keep getting questions from the media and from the audience. We'll be able to ask you those questions at the end. Now, moving on to our next session. And here, we want to discuss the question, which is also quite important for the current environmental agenda. What is the impact of crisis on the sustainable development strategy of business in short-term and long-term prospects? And here we welcome Mr. Sergei Chesnov, representing Rusal, and at the same time he also is in charge of Commission of the Economics of Climate Change and Sustainable Development in ICC Russia, and also Luke Manning from Refinitiv, Global Strategy, Sustainability and Corporate Risk Manager. First, we give the floor to Alexey. Okay, Mr. Manning, my question to you: how did crisis impact the global markets? Is there any difference between how the crisis impacted the traditional business and the businesses who really have a working sustainable development strategy?
Thanks, Sergey, for the question. Look, I think fundamentally, financial markets, if you look at them, they're really just a reflection of the real economy. So they can't escape the impact of the lockdown measures we're seeing. They can't escape the drop in production. They can't escape the drop in demand. They can't escape the sort of the drop in confidence, I guess, that we're seeing across the world. And also, if you see countries now starting to come out of lockdown, with it, the markets are slowly rebuilding as well. If I was an investor, if I was a fund manager, I'd be looking at my portfolio at the moment, and I look at it through three lenses. I think it would be adaptation, transition, resilience. That'd be the three things I'd be looking for. And I think they're the qualities that will need to be shown to determine who bounces back the quickest, who bounces back the strongest. And in the short term, out of those three, I think resilience is key. And something, Kayo just said there, just in case resilience, I thought that was a brilliant comment. I love that. I've written it down in my little book here. I think when you're talking about a business being a sustainable one or a more traditional one, or more, that gives them more traditional products or service, I think if you look at that short term, that resilience piece, if you can't weather the storm, it doesn't really matter what type of business you are at this stage. If you can't get through this and you're not going to make it, you're not going to be able to fulfill those ambitions. If they're sustainable ambitions if that's the path you're taking, you won't be able to get there. So if anything, at the moment, I think what we're really seeing in the short term is not sustainable versus non-sustainable. We're seeing digital versus physical. The pandemic, I think, it's absolutely discriminated between physical and digital. And as we move to recovery mode, it's without doubt the digital ones that are going to flourish even more. And I think we're going to see digital be absolutely top of that agenda more and more. But equally, longer term, I do think sustainable businesses, this is in the long term now, I do think they'd be better positioned, because I think it will be, the markets they operate in, the demand for what they do, their brand value, their ability to attract and retain the very best talents. They're likely to have more resilient supply chains as well. So that really does play into those other phrases I use, adaptation and transition. I think those businesses will be much better positioned. And I think if you look at that, to a certain extent, you can see that in the market. ESG funds, they're holding up pretty well in the market at the moment. I looked at some of our Refinitiv data, and in the first quarter of this year, there's $36 billion has gone into ESG funds. So that's held remarkably steady, really, considering the impact we've seen in the markets. And if you also look at the performance of those funds, that's interesting. So we analysed 30,000 equity funds in this quarter, first quarter of this year. And of conventional funds, 55% of those underperformed against this range of technical indicators that they judged it against. Whereas you looked at 55% of the ones that had integrated ESG criteria in, they overperformed in the same period. Now, granted, it's a very small period, and it's not one that's statistically particularly big or relevant, but it's interesting. It's starting to shed some light on perhaps some emerging trends. So really, adaptation, transition, resilience, that's, I think, what the market's looking for at the moment.
Thank you, Mr. Manning. It would only be logical to address my question to Sergey now, asking him about how did business survive this current storm, and how the crisis will impact corporate programs and sustainable development strategies. Will they contract or will they be expanded? Thank you very much. I think the sound is really soft, really low. I learned 2 lessons out of this situation in our current situation. Economic crisis followed. Why do I say all this? We need to be really careful about all challenges that we face right now and not forget about one thing. Of course, we shouldn't be forgetting economy. At the same time, we shouldn't be forgetting climate change efforts and the goals of reducing GHG emissions. But this time, most of Russian businesses were able to see for themselves how realistic it really was. And now they think more about social and corporate responsibility, and all those measures allowed us to prevent the disaster that would lead to overall stoppage of businesses. And we also have goal 8 in the Sustainable Development Goals, decent work and economic growth. Here, international cooperation is particularly important, as well as cooperation between business and the civil society. As for what to do next, if a business does not follow Sustainable Development Goals, will fail in the market. Now the market does not need companies who ignore the future of entire humanity. Recently, I heard at one of the roundtable discussions that they were willing to buy greener products even if they are sold at a higher price. And it's also a matter of corporate and social responsibility. It's good that we were able to get together here, and thank you. My next question is to Mr. Manning. Will the crisis change the mood and investment preferences of investors? Are investors and consumers ready to pay a little more for greener products and assets?
Yeah, look, I think the mood has changed without doubt. And the main reason is that, a little bit like, alluding to what Sergey just said, but the pandemic's provided much more clarity than ever before on the correlation between social impact, humanitarian impact, and economic impact. It's really, I think, sharpened the focus for investors even more on this social aspect, particularly on sustainability. And I said in my last piece about, we're starting to see these interesting trends when it comes to performance. And I also think that this moment in time, if you like, that we're sat in, will accelerate a shift in preference as well, not just performance, but preference. I think, and this touches on something Angelina said, I think there was almost a little bit of complacency before the pandemic. There was almost complacency that our modern way of life was in some way shock-proof. And what this has shown is that the foundations of how we live are actually pretty shallow. They can still be fundamentally shaken. And it's this heightened awareness of vulnerability. That was Angelina's point, and I think she's spot on. The coronavirus, it didn't give us any time to prepare. So it's led to this reflex that we see, reflex in government response, reflex in financial markets. And I think this sharpened focus I was talking about will inevitably bring up the environmental question as well. And for me, again, which has been spoken about by the other panelists, it looms much larger, much larger than what we've got now on the horizon. If some of those worst predicted climate scenarios play out, talking 2.5 degrees warmer, 3 degrees warmer, 4 degrees warmer, the shock waves are far bigger than what we're experiencing now. But I guess the good news of all of this is it won't come as a surprise. It can't come as a surprise like the coronavirus did. We don't need that reflex reaction. So I think this shift in mindset we've got at the moment will almost certainly play out far stronger when it comes to environmental considerations, short and long term.
Thank you, Mr. Manning. Just one question to Sergey. What can be a driver to restore business from the crisis, and can sustainable development be this kind of driver? It's a repetition of that question. Can sustainable development be the driver for business?
Good here.
For any business, the main driver is the demand for its products or services. And it will help us be more resilient to crises, to those black swans that are lurking in the distance. And the main driver should be the market. We should cultivate and cherish this demand for greener products. And if we're talking about climate development goals, it should be cultivated on the government level and on the level of individual consumers. so that they choose greener products, all other things being equal, because for example, a product with a certain label that says that it has left a smaller carbon footprint, when the international trade is not based on negative issues but through positive things and exchange of greener products, then many issues will be resolved much quicker. And at the same time, we shouldn't forget the problems of developing countries who have no opportunity to reduce their uh, emissions in the economic sense. There are lots of problems that we can only tackle together through international cooperation. And this terrible situation we're in right now has shown it to us once again. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chesnoy. And now our final portion, which is development devoted to lessons that we need to learn based on this crisis. And for that, we welcome Eugene Kuznetsov from Orbiter Capital Partners, ambassador of the Singularity University, and Mr. Sochen Zhang, president of FinTech and for Good and member of the executive board of UN ESPN. We are running a little bit late, so please be concise as you answer. And you have the same question for both of you. My first question first goes to Mr. Xiao Chen. Which technologies were most efficient to fight the coronavirus? What were the ones that we could predict, and which technologies were unexpected? Microphone, please.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity, and I really enjoy this conversation. And firstly, that I want to say that Mr. Latif's narrative was very important. We need to compare the past, then we know what is the present, and the technology which really actually can help us to address this binary thinking, to just remove the dependence of environment and social with the economy. That will be the powerful technology which it can just really help address. The second part is that during the pandemic, it's very clear social entrepreneurs actually are doing better than the normal mainstream business. The reason is very simple, that they are being established to take care of people, to take care of environment. They are better prepared to deal with the pandemic. So that's why when Luke was talking about ESG funds performance, it's very clear that they are now better prepared. So when we talk about the technology side, all the technologies which can help us to really remove those dependency and enable the social entrepreneurs to, and also mainstream business to just address those risks will just be very important. Give a few examples. Connectivity, and with the pandemic, and many of the learning, working, and supply chain all moved to digital. And without the digital infrastructure, and the student cannot be online, and people cannot work from home. So any countries, companies have to invest in digital infrastructure, 5G, mobile, internet, to connect people. Then the digital can really just help us to survive the pandemic. Second part of the technology is around the accountability side. When we are enter into this pandemic, and many of the question will be that who are accountable for what, and can we deliver that support at the right time to the right folks? And digital ID, blockchain, those technology which can create trust and remove human errors will be really important. The third type of technology I categorize as the touchless economy type of technology, using robotic to just replace the human workers, then they can just avoid being transmitted of infected, and using job of delivery for essential goods like drones, and digital learning, online working, medicine, and online events, and even house party online will really help to address those kind of things. Of course, we are conducting all the digital economy related activity. We need everyone have a digital payment, mobile, digital wallet to receive and do the transaction. Lastly, around fundraising, because during this time, many times that people who really need the money cannot get from the banks. Then we need crowd investing vehicles which can enable communities to just mobilize fund to address their challenges. So although, of course, technology cannot solve all the problems, but they are really part of the future. Now you are investing in this kind of technology, you are investing in future.
All right, now my next question is to Eugene. It's a similar question. What are those technologies that have shown their efficiency as we fight the pandemic? What kind of technologies do we need to change our system in the future to get to sustainable development goals? The pandemic has shown this transformation in the economy, which makes the existing trends even stronger. We've been talking about digital control and monitoring over people and mixing big data from different sources that would allow us to come up with new tools to understand the consumer behavior, not just online but offline as well. During the pandemic, it has become an important tool of direct monitoring over those who stayed at home, and these technologies were introduced or deployed slowly in the past. Now they are deployed more actively. It also stimulated the biotech. Everyone is looking at biotech right now, development of new vaccines, and now, if in the past it took years to introduce new vaccines, now it might take only about a year. It will be a huge breakthrough for biotechnologies. COVID is a tricky and cunning disease, hurting, damaging many different systems in the body. And as we treat COVID infection, it will improve the overall quality of our life. This is the direct COVID result. And we can see that the processes of new technological revolution is going on. Automation and introduction of robotics before the crisis, preserving jobs used to be the argument against robotics. Now companies require more and more automation because they face the problem of lockdown. Similarly, in fintech and other industries, in the past, there were risks that it might hurt the economy. Currently, it's much simpler to offer new technologies. It's easier for the companies to introduce them in the situation, in the current situation in the economy. It's simpler to deploy and unroll new process now. Even though the coronavirus did hurt the economy a lot, at the same time it gives new industries a chance to come out from this pressure from traditional technologies that it used to slow it down. My final question to our Chinese colleague, it's again a question to both of you. Where do we need to invest now to get some profit and at the same time survive next crisis as we learned today?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I think the first type of investments is really around risk assessment, because only we know, where are the most vulnerable population, and what kind of risk we are exposed to, then we can better prepare as a society, as a company, as an individual. So I think digital technology, digital tools, which can help, to assess the vulnerability and also getting everyone prepared to just for the get the digital infrastructure ready. Those are the first type of opportunities, which not only you address the current problem, but you also are preparing you for the future. The second is for current investors. If you're a later stage type of investor, you have to look at your portfolio now and review your assets, whether they are COVID-19 proof, because we are going to live with COVID-19 for a long time. And if you have some bad assets which have not included COVID-19 proof, that might be a long-term problem for you. And for the early stage, that definitely touchless economy is a rising sector, and where that's a lot of new innovation need to emerge. And any early stage investors, please just look at the touchless economy related business models. Lastly, it's around the impact investors, and we all see that governments in any part of the world are overwhelmed, and also the mainstream business are overwhelmed. So then impact investors have so much work to do, because these are the people, these are the environments which need our help. So then we are definitely see that from mainstream business, government, all are really taking impact investing and the social entrepreneurship at another level. And this is an opportunity for the impact sector folks to just take the opportunity to communicate with your stakeholders and get them to invest together with you, and enable our marginalized group to get help and also prepare them for the future.
The same question to Eugene. In the context of the crisis, and not only that, all industries connected to new technology revolution are important. That's artificial intelligence in all its forms, a variety of services in different industries using AI and big data processing, which gives us much better results than traditional businesses. Then we see continuing automation and robotics in many industries, in logistics and transport and services. Clean tech is back, and renewable energy and smart grids are popular, and different devices to accumulate and save energy and store energy, which will help us deal with issues which were hard to resolve in the past. Also, genome sequencing and a new systemic approach to biological processes. All right, thank you, distinguished colleagues. Now we have some time for questions that we got from the audience. We have a few hundred of them listening and watching from the media. We have questions to individual experts. My first question goes to Kayo Kochweser. Here's my question, or the question from the audience. What is the role of banks in the development of green economy in the world and in Russia? If you know anything about Russia, what kind of difficulties banks might face as they have to introduce the principles of responsible investing in their actions? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think the banking industry has made big strides in the area of sustainable finance, partly because their shareholders and the public at large insist. We have much more shareholder activism at annual general meetings, assemblies of these banks, partly because they see real opportunities for a huge market. That's what people want to invest on, ESG. And partly because of the risk side. I'm particularly, as a former banker, keen on having the risk disclosure, which I mentioned briefly in my points, risk disclosure in corporate and bank balance sheets advanced much faster. Now, banks see this coming, and therefore you have now a big alliance. These are hundreds of actors who follow what Mark Carney and others developed. I was somewhat involved, the principles for carbon disclosure in corporate balance sheets. And as I said, I think these should become mandatory. Banks anticipate that. So the big banks who have moved faster in this area are beginning to reap the profits. So both from a risk and opportunity point of view, this is very much in an evolution that now entails almost all banks. And of course, what banks finance in terms of energy efficiency, in terms of renewables, with sometimes with leverage by public funds through World Bank and international financial institutions being made available for emerging markets, is a huge business area. So I think the risk of inaction is much higher as the problems of making that transition. And I think the message has been received. It came a bit slowly, but I think we are getting there. That's not to say that not a huge task still ahead in this area. And again, another big player in that field are the big global pension funds and asset managers who ask also from the banks they invest in that they follow ESG and other criteria. So I think these pension funds, the sovereign wealth funds with the Norges fund of the Norwegians who had gone ahead, but also many of the sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, the big asset management funds are leading the way. And banks follow, of course, because that is good business. So I'm relatively optimistic on that front. May I add that I hope Russian banks, I mean, you have the Sberbank and others, big players. I think Hermann Gref and others understand this very well. And there are beginnings in the Russian banking scene. I would hope that there will be fast movement in these directions I describe also on the Russian banking front, including in the international activities.
Thank you, Mr. Kochweiser. We got a question from Sputnik China, and it goes to Angelina Davidova. In your opinion, how did the pandemic emphasize the importance of international cooperation in the environment? Has the environmental cooperation suffered because of mutual blame that was thrown around between countries? Can we restore that mutual trust and restart of cooperation? A number of other speakers spoke today already and said that the pandemic has shown the importance of international cooperation on a variety of issues, be it medical issues, epidemiology, science and technology, and environmental issues were also part of this process. Cooperation in the environment is the key factor to get some serious results at the level of the entire world. Well, without the financial support, without the technical support, without the professional support between these countries, we will not be able to get those good results those Paris Agreement goals that all countries agreed on, and we will hardly reach sustainable development goals that countries agreed on in 2015. All right, how did the pandemic impact the environmental cooperation? Of course, many events that were planned and real physical meetings of experts on the governmental level, of course, they did not happen. Let me give you a major example of the plans that existed for a conference between the EU, European Commission, and Russia on climate and climate policy, which had to be organized in Skolkovo school in Moscow in mid-March. It was cancelled. The informal consultations are still going on online, but not as efficiently as we would like them to. All right, has slowed down a bit, much like the of international negotiations at the UN level, which Agrafina mentioned. It has been postponed for a year, but gradually the world is opening up. The events are moving from offline to online, and pretty soon we will see the restart of the dialogue on climate on the international level. Based on my experience in the UN negotiations, I would say that this track of international cooperation is sort of separate from other areas. And even if some countries have some differences in other areas that were mentioned in the question, it still does not impact much the climate dialogue. Thank you, Angelina. My next question goes to Ms. Kotova. This question actually came from Germany to Agrafina. How probable is the adoption of the green recovery package by the Russian government, and what could become its part? We need your expert opinion here. Thank you for your question. It is an interesting one. The green recovery package and the decision to approve it, this is not something that I'm competent in. Thank you for this question. I can say what should be part of that package for Russia based on what is being discussed in those intergovernmental commissions with the EU countries and elsewhere. These should be projects for the targeted sustainable development of the economy, climate, adaptation. At the end of December, there was a meeting of a joint group with Switzerland, where we said that there was this comprehensive set of investment projects open for international investments, and this was the bridge that we could build to where we could select environmentally friendly technologies together. Low carbon development, climate and adaptation. That would be the most important points. Thank you. My next question, and we got it from a German publication, Berliner Telegraph. It goes to Klaus. In 2022, all nuclear power plants will be decommissioned, but they will still present a danger because to fully dismantle them it would take dozens of years. There's no consensus in the EU on that issue. France and Belgium, on the contrary, continue to develop their nuclear energy. Does it make sense for Germany to fully abandon electricity produced by the nuclear power plants? And can there be any consensus in the EU on that issue? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very specific question. And it's really a crucial one. Germany was one country after Fukushima who really decided to phase out nuclear with a concrete plan and with a approach of all parties in Germany and stakeholders together. And there was a timeline to follow. And of course, we have to find out how it's matching with all the plans of other countries in the EU. The EU depends on a common approach, specifically in the approach of the European Green Deal. And we have still today a mixture of different kinds of energy in our grid, nuclear, coal, and renewable, and gas, and so. That must be negotiated, of course, how to do it well, and to be a showcase also for the world. I would say Germany really shows up how difficult it is, if you have the plan to phase out nuclear, how to deal with the rest risk, and it's a tremendous one, in future with the nuclear waste. And we have not today, we know how much it costs, but we have not really a good plan how to deal with this waste of nuclear. And we have to discuss this with all our neighbors, with all our friends in the world, how to do it right. And it's of course a danger for all of us if it's in the wrong hands, these nuclear waste for our common future. And that is a must to find a right way in between of the EU. But we have to do it also on the level of neighborhood with Russia and others, with Ukraine, of course, with Chernobyl and so. Yeah, it's a difficult question, and there's not a king's way to come out of this. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And we have a final question from Sputnik China, a news agency. It goes to our Chinese colleague, Mr. Xiao Jian. What is your assessment of Russia-China cooperation in the environmental area? Can you recall any good examples of Russia-China cooperation in the environment protection area? Are there any problems in that area between the countries as well?
Thank you for the question, and I think that this just reminded me of a few years ago. I was there to participate in Moscow's climate change summit, where that's many of my Chinese colleagues who joined the mission together with me, and was there sharing with technology-enabled climate innovation tested in China. And I think that was a really interesting experience. And I do see that from the business level, there are a lot of existing channel for collaboration and idea exchange and solution sharing. And at the policy level, that's I think China and the China and Russia has been working together on the climate issues for a long time. And while the time when I was still with the UN on climate negotiation, and I do see that during the process and China and Russia have been collaborating on many issues before. And as of the future, and I think there are three main areas which really are very promising. And one is the implementation of the Paris Agreement, and we all know the cost and the challenge all the countries are facing. And I think China, Russia through knowledge sharing and international cooperation, study tour, and different types of vehicle, and learn from each other how to implement the Paris Agreement will be a very important part of the future international climate infrastructure. The second promising areas is around technology enabled climate solution, and where that's there are a lot of digital technologies such as blockchain, fintech, digital infrastructure payments, which are tested in China. And from the Russia side, when I was there last time, and I do also see many we were toured by the Russian side of a lot of very interesting innovation there. And I think especially from the telecom side, and I think two countries from technology collaboration is crucial and also are very promising. The last piece is around the communication, because we do see that when the world is facing pandemic and all the challenge, and multilateralism is facing challenge. And so then, not only China and Russia, but all the major countries, or all the countries, and need to just working together to figure out a way how to continue the multilateralism and continue the dialogue, continue the collaboration, and not to just use the short term and also the near term challenge to prevent us from the long term collaboration. Thank you.
In conclusion, just what we call a quick quiz, so to speak, before we move on to the final part of our discussion. And hundreds of people joined us, which has shown huge interest to this topic here in Russia. To this topic, these were very different people, the young ones and the professionals. We got questions from the representatives of banks and business. I think it's the right time for all of us to reach this understanding of global issues, and it got us all closer. Let me use this opportunity and this discussion as sort of concentration of this positive force to sum up the results. Let me ask each speaker to answer this final question. It will be a little different from what we sent you. It will be the same for all, but this is how it goes. Which lessons for sustainable development of the world we need to learn from the crisis in the context of partnership of our countries? Lessons learned for our partnership. 2 minutes to each speaker, some vivid messages for our audience and for the report that we will come up based on this discussion. We'll start with Mr. Milke.
Yeah, thank you very much for this opportunity again. I would say the key challenges are work on multilateralism, work on solidarity. We didn't mention the most vulnerable countries in the world, the most suffering in the world, in Latin America, in other parts of India. And so it's important to have this in mind. Solidarity is a must, and the, as I called it, transformative cooperation on all levels. That is also needed. And then there could be some common future for the 7.5 billion people now in the world. When I was born, it was only 2.5 billion people in the world, on this planet. And so how to deal with this in a peaceful manner, that is really a challenge for all of us. And that is lessons learned perhaps also with the coronavirus crisis. There is much possible if you have governments, if you have regulation, and it's explained in a good way. And to see that can also be done regarding the climate crisis and the sustainability crisis in which we are today already. Yeah, that perhaps is a positive approach, and we should do it, and we should do it in a peaceful manner. Thank you.
Now, moving on, Ms. Kotova. Thank you, Alexey. Lessons learned. Okay, let me start with this environmental law, that a system is most sustainable when it has many good and strong connections and ties. This crisis has shown that different countries may have their different ways or paths based on their culture and specifics, but without experience exchange and knowledge exchange, and sometimes exchange of direct help, without mutual cooperation, we would not be able to move any further. International cooperation is the most important lesson from this crisis. Now, Mr. Latif, you're next.
He's already out. He couldn't stay.
Then it's Ms. Davidova. Thank you, Alexey. I have 5 very brief points. Number 1, I think we realized that certain things can happen really quickly. They could be unpredictable. They could be growing exponentially. Our brain cannot always quickly understand such changes and adapt to those changes fast enough. This unpredictability, what happened today, can happen anytime in the future. I really enjoyed the quote from one of our speakers. Let me quote that phrase once again and mention this once again as one of the ideas that I would get from our discussion. It's about sustainability, or rather resilience instead of efficiency. Resilience instead of efficiency. It's an important point of how we think about development. It has to be broad, has to be systemic, it has to be balanced, has to include social and environmental and climatic factors in all of them. Number 3, cooperation was mentioned here by other speakers, working for the common good. Number 4 is the importance of investments into infrastructure, social infrastructure, educational infrastructure. Number 5, the pandemic and the response measures have shown that many countries began to think about human beings, individuals, not about GDP or economy at large, but specifically most vulnerable people to this new virus. It's very valuable, but to make this mentality broader, we need to start thinking about human beings not as the center of everything, but as part of the system in which we live, part of the planet Earth, human being as a factor that brings about global changes on the planet. And we live in the time of the special time, and the human being who is mortal and vulnerable and can suffer from what they do. It's focusing on human beings as a part of the ecosystem. That's my point number 5. Thank you. All right, Mr. Kochweiser.
One lesson, one task, I would say. We have learned, that is the lesson, that unabated globalization, belief in markets, belief only in efficiency of markets, has its downsides. And we are learning now, after decades of globalization that clearly moved many out of poverty around the globe, there's a downside. There's the other side of the coin. So resilience, as some of us were saying, resilience rather than only efficiency will be the big theme or the big lesson here. But to steer that resilience in the right directions will be the task. So the task is that we might see in future some smarter globalization, which leads also to some deglobalization, but that should not come at the expense of internationalism, internationalization, and multilateral cooperation. So deglobalization, to some extent, will be inevitable, but international cooperation should not go down as a result or in tandem here, quite the contrary. And of course, the global public goods and bads, as this pandemic has shown and as climate crisis will show, undoubtedly can only be dealt with international cooperation. So that's the lesson, is the limits of globalization and the risks. The task is deglobalization, not at the expense of internationalism and internationalization.
Thank you. Mr. Chesnoy, you're next. This crisis has shown that the UN Sustainable Development Goals really matter, and if you ignore them, it might lead to a huge challenge for all of us. No more selfishness. We need to develop this kind of real cooperation. We cannot resolve our issues at the expense of others, but only together. It may sound too lofty, but I'm convinced that only together we can deal with all the challenges that are the consequences of this disease or the global warming. In other words, we faced this one terrible crisis, and that will make us more aware of the next upcoming possible climate crisis, and people will demand more decisive measures, starting with ourselves. Mr. Manning is next.
Thank you, Sergey. And when you mentioned lessons, it just took me back to a conversation I only had a few days ago with my children, and they said to me, when I'm learning about history at school, everything in the old days seems so big. It's always these big moments, and compared to everyday life, when we're going to school and going down the park or going in the garden, whatever they're doing, it all just seems unthinkable compared to our day-to-day life now. And then they said, do you think that what we're living through now, do you think it's going to be one of those big moments? We're going to live through a big moment. And I think they're right. I think we will. And the images that we've seen of the world in lockdown are going to be etched into those history books. But really the big thing is probably not now, it's what happens next. And so I think the first lesson just will be that in a way the world's been paused momentarily. And it's, again, you said lofty there, Sergei Chesnoy, just before, and it sounds a bit, but it almost feels like it's given us a second chance in some ways, just to perhaps alter our direction. So I think the first lesson is we've been given a bit of a second chance here. And the second one is that having been given that chance, we can't be lazy. We can't just slip back into sort of restoring what were unsustainable, less resilient patterns, if you like, of the past. And I think the third is if we can't unite, whether that's governments, businesses, NGOs, whatever, behind a sustainable technology-led recovery, if we can't unite behind this, I wonder what we can unite behind.
Mr. Kuznetsov, you are next. I'd like to say that we are not ready to use new technologies and predict the future. We live a little bit in the past. We are always late. The pandemic crisis was forecast and predicted a long time ago based on a lot of data. Theoretically, we should have prepared much better for the crisis, and the coordination of international institutions and national healthcare systems could have been much better if people listened to forecasts and predictions. And many technologies were ready to help people in these situations, but they were not deployed in the conservative environment. Let me give you a simple example. The 3D printers and making masks for doctors in Italy, when people had to invent these tools that were lacking at the government level. We need to strengthen the quick response tools and quick adaptation to a new situation. We need to reduce red tape and reduce the dependence on conservative solutions and come up with quicker opportunities for high tech that may become available at a certain moment. During the crisis, those companies and societies that quickly responded and adjusted to the situation benefited. Those who started using certain solutions earlier and policies earlier, they won. My main message is that we need to be less conservative, be more open to new solutions, and introduce them as quick as they can to overcome the crisis. Thank you. And Mr. Zhang, you are the last one to speak.
Thank you very much. And I think, as of the lessons and a few. Number one is really, we are too easy to just get comfortable about today and short term, and losing the long-term vision. Finally, that's we are, be put into a very uncomfortable situation. And so we need to have that long-term thinking as our daily life, daily practice. Number two is that when we are put into a very uncomfortable situation, that a binary thinking just comes. There's either white or black, or there's right or wrong. There's always only zero-sum game. And I think very importantly that, we do need to just always find a third way. And the third way, which actually doesn't really, conclude us to be zero game. And then we find opportunity for all parties. And the third one is that at the political level there will always be challenge here and there, but I think to keep all level of communication is essential, and the political dialogue conversation need to happen. But in the meantime, at the civil society level, business level, and no matter what, and some conversation has to be maintained, and only when we continue to communicate, share, and then we are able to just solve the problem as humanity and helping everyone who we love. Thank you.
Dear colleagues, thanks a lot. And in conclusion, let me say that we are now closer to reaching some consensus on how critical environment and sustainability are for us. We have stated that the pandemic have strengthened the importance of, has emphasized the importance of environment and climate. We will be getting back to that as we approach the world, post-pandemic world. I'd like to thank the participants and partners, the Russian Carbon Fund F20, Russian Partnership for the Preservation of the Climate. Thank you very much, and see you later here at the Valdai Club.